Who are you? How do you answer that question? If someone came up and said, "Who are you?" How would you answer? Do you refer to your job? Your hobbies? Some status? Your family? Talents? Gifts? Skills you have? Do you even know who you are? And if not, how do you find out? You talk to Michelle. That's her thing. Where exactly does your identity lie? Like, where is it located? When you want to remember who you are, where do you look? When Ryan and Cheryl went to give this new precious baby an identity, how do they do it? One of my favorite Disney princess movies. Yes, I have a favorite Disney princess movie. I could blame it and say I have a daughter, but that's not really it. Freddie, do you have a favorite Disney princess movie?
No, man.
Thanks, Dad.
I'm here for you.
Yeah. Ryan and Cheryl have one. Anyway, what was I saying? My favorite Disney princess movie is probably Moana. And it's my favorite, not just because Lin-Manuel Miranda did the music, but it's my favorite really because I resonate so much with her struggle. How many have seen the movie Moana? That's what I thought. So, Moana is a young teenage girl, because that's what all Disney princesses are. And she lives on a little island in the Pacific Ocean. And she senses this call on her life. And those aren't my words, those are hers in the movie. It's described as a call. But almost no one else around her recognizes it, except for her grandmother. And she struggles to understand her identity both in this village and within this call, and how should she respond to it? And sometimes is she even able to believe it herself? I've had a long struggle coming to grips with my own identity and calling. I fought my calling for several years. Part of it was I just didn't want to go into the family business. My grandfather's ordained, both my parents, both my brothers. I married into a family where my wife's parents are ordained, as well as one of her brothers. Like, it's just what we do. And that's not why I wanted to do it. Not to mention, my dad was telling me all the time, if you can do anything else, do that. But once I started to follow it, once I surrendered to the call and said, okay, and leaned into it, others didn't understand it or accept it. They told me my wiring was wrong, that I had to be different. What do we do? What do we do when our identity is confused? How do we sort out the struggle of our identity? You know, Jesus never seems to struggle with this. Like, he doesn't struggle with his identity. He always seems to have clarity about who he is and what he's called to do. Even during the temptation in the wilderness and in the Garden of Gethsemane, he remains focused and clear on his own identity and calling. Where did Jesus get this clarity? Was he just born with it? Is it just because he's Jesus and he's got that supernatural cheat code? Like early in his life, he just up, down, left, up, down, left, right, A, B, B, A. Kurt got that joke. You're welcome. I think we see it here in Luke 2. Here is where we find where Jesus' identity lies. So let's look at Luke chapter 2, 22 through 40, because what we have here is a story in 3 parts. Part one frames the story. Jesus and his family going to the temple, presenting Jesus to the Lord, and it begins and ends the section, right? Parts 2 and 3 are the reactions of Simeon and Anna. Each have a role in the narrative and reveal some of Jesus' identity. So let's start with them. Simeon is a devout man, filled with the Holy Spirit. Now, we talk about him as if he's old. And that's kind of an assumption on our part because it does not say what his age is. We assume that he's old because he's been told he's going to live to see the Messiah, and that once he finds Jesus, he's like, now I'm ready to go. And most people in their 30s aren't ready to go. Even if they're like, I'm going to be alive to see the Messiah. Oh, I saw him, I can die now. Like, usually that's for later. But however long he's been alive, he's been a devout and righteous person. And he's longed for the consolation of Israel. And he's led by the Spirit to the temple on the same day that Jesus is presented to the Lord. And he encounters Jesus and his family and speaks this powerful, beautiful prophetic word over Jesus and over Mary. And he says that Jesus is going to be a decision point for people. That's what he means by saying the rising and falling of many. That you can follow him, you can deny him, but one thing you cannot do is ignore him. When we encounter Jesus, it is inevitably, for anyone that encounters him, a decision point. Anna's story is a little similar, although it has a little less detail. She's a prophet of the tribe of Asher, which I'm just going to say that again. Anna, a woman, is a prophet. Okay, now that I've said that a second time. She was widowed early in life. She was married and her husband died after 7 years, and then never remarried. And instead devoted her life to worshiping day and night in the temple. And similarly to Simeon, she comes at the right time, which probably wasn't as hard for her because she's there all the time. But she's there and encounters Jesus and begins to go around telling all who believe and were looking forward to the redemption of Israel. So Jesus' identity is certainly revealed here, spoken by 2 very pious and faithful people. What a great way to receive one's identity. I'm actually reminded of the story of my grandfather when he met Chris Cox for the first time as a little baby, and he told Linda that he was going to be a wonderful servant and worshiper of the Lord. And he did. What a cool way to get your identity, to have someone speak a prophetic utterance over who you are called to be at that age. Not everyone is so lucky. Not everyone gets prophetic words at their presentation. But let's not forget part one, the framing story. Because it's easy to think all of Jesus' identity is contained in those prophetic utterances of Simeon. But let's not forget the framing part. Jesus is presented to the Lord along with the purification of Mary. Like, you realize it's because it says, I'm going to do the purification ritual. That's not for Jesus. That's for Mary, because she's had a baby. And if anybody has been in a room during childbirth, you know there are lots of ickiness. Thank you, Sandy. And the ancient Israel people had various responses to said ickiness that required purification. But they're going because it's required by the law, which is something that Luke emphasizes throughout this story. And it made me wonder, what does this say about Jesus? And I think it tells us, what I realized is it tells us that Jesus grew up in a family that meticulously observed the law of Moses. Luke reminds us of that no less than 5 times in this story, that they're doing this because it's what the law demanded. So he's putting this emphasis that this is a family that does what the law commands. So Jesus is deeply embedded within the Mosaic tradition. It's a tradition he would certainly come into some tension with, but never as an outsider. He is born, bred, and raised in Israel's story. And so any tension he comes up with people, he comes in as an insider, like, I have been in this. I have swam in these waters my whole life. And in doing that, it has prepared him to oppose the flawed and hollowed rituals and practices, because he's quite familiar with them and their purpose. Now let's bring Simeon and Anna back in. They function in this story almost as a stand-in for Israel. Not just for the people of Israel, but for the ideal nation of Israel. They are devout. They're at home in the temple, and they're longing and hoping for fulfillment of God's promises. So they become the stand-in for the ideal, proper, true Israel that is devout, that is at home in the temple, in the house of the Lord, and looking forward to its redemption. And they stand in for that. They're the representation of Israel and how Israel should respond to the coming Messiah. And so let's add all of this in together. Jesus being raised in a family that meticulously follows the law and encountered by the true Israel and given this prophetic word of he's going to be this decision point and he's going to be a savior for Israel and for all. And all of this, we put all of this into a bowl and we mix it all up, and what comes out is one thing. And it's to embed Jesus' identity within Israel's story. Which means that Jesus' identity does not come in a vacuum. Simeon and Anna don't offer out of nowhere. They're part of Israel's story and narrative. In fact, they're representing Israel's story and narrative in Jesus' story. And so identity is not birthed out of a void or out of a vacuum or just out of the ether. It is birthed out of a particular story with its own set of values and rituals. It comes in and through our context, providing clarity and purpose with the same. Right? So it's not, Jesus' identity doesn't come from out in the ether. Jesus' identity is very much connected to and wedded to and embedded in Israel's story. In Moana, she finds the strength to lean into her calling. She struggles with it through the first part of the movie, through the first 20 minutes of the movie, and then finds the strength to lean into it by leaning into her people's story. She discovers that they were once voyagers discovering new islands. And then later in the movie, when she is at her lowest point, when she is full of the most doubt, when she's full of doubt and unsure that she's doing what she's supposed to be doing, when she's unsure if that calling was ever real, the spirit of her grandmother shows up, and she is asked to remind herself who she is by retelling the story of her people and her place within that story. And it's such a powerful moment, and because I resonated with it so much, I never get through the movie without crying at that moment. I found my identity and was able to lean more into that identity by becoming clearer as I unpacked my own story. By unpacking and reckoning with my experience, it revealed what God was doing in me and how that leads into God's call on me. The realization that interacting with false images of the kingdom has led to a passion to pursue the true kingdom enabled me to file off my own counterfeit expressions and equipped me to lead in more authentic expressions. Church, our identity as altar didn't emerge in a vacuum either. It has been lovingly crafted through our communal life that has gone on for generations. It is absolutely who God has called us to be. Where we are now is absolutely where God has called us to be, but that call didn't come out of the blue. That call didn't come from out in a vacuum. It came and it took living into different and difficult places, but it allowed that formation to take place. Who we are today, where we're going from here, is embedded in and directly tied to the story of where we've been and who we are and who we've been. It's a story that begins with Doyle sitting right there and the journey that he and his family and the people of Florida Avenue Church, and I can't remember the name of what the church was before that, and I think it's been a couple of times before it became Florida Avenue, before it became Oak Grove, before it became Altar. That is our story. And our identity we didn't change our identity when we became Altar. Instead, becoming Altar was an expression of living out the identity that God has been working in us for the last 75, 80 years. Understanding our identity gives us purpose for our mission through revealing what and how we are to do. When you know who you are, it sets boundaries and gives direction over what you do, where you go, and how you do things. You go places because that's who we are, that's what we do. Or you don't do things because that's not who you are. I suspect, I'm pretty confident about this, I suspect that's why when I went out, when I was in high school, one of the things my dad would always tell me when I left was, remember who you are. Because it's not just about knowing what to do. It gives us the boundaries and the barriers to know what not to do, where not to go, because that's valuable and gives us the courage to oppose false identities. There are lots of good things that you could do. There is an endless list of good things we could do as a church. So many things that we can't possibly do them all. So how do we know which things we should do? Do we just try them all? Like, that's not going to work. That's too many. So how do we know? Which things are, like, when we see that church doing this thing, and it looks really good, and it's producing results, and we see this church over here doing something else, and that looks really good, and this church over here is doing really good, and then we've got feeling like, what are we supposed to be doing? Should we just do what they're doing? That's why identity matters. Because it's our identity that centers us, that anchors us, and embeds us in the story of God at work in us. So that when we are presented with things, because not everything every other church does that looks good is good, and not everything that another church does that is good for us. And so, how do we discern what we do as well as what we don't do? And the answer lies in our identity. Knowing our story, anchored in God's love, anchored in His presence. The Old Testament word is chesed. Anchored in that is where our identity lies. When I go through my journals and I'm questioning, what are we doing? Where should we go? I get kind of frustrated sometimes because I want God to tell me what to do. And God constantly ignores my questions of what should I do and answers the question of who am I? And after a while, I get kind of annoyed. I'm like, I get it. I know who I am. Just tell me what to do. And God's like, well, we'll get to that. Have I told you who you are? And so it's not just looking back at your experience, but it's looking back and being aware of how God has been present and at work in your life. Have you perceived God's presence and activity in your own story? Have you been able to perceive it in our story? Because if we fail to notice how God is working in it, that's when we may misunderstand or misidentify our identity. Because true knowledge, even self-knowledge, is found in God. It's found in Jesus. And if we're not careful, and we're not paying attention to where God is present and at work, and has been present and at work, then we begin to believe identities that lie to us. But we'll deal with that next week. We'll deal with that next week. We had the opportunity last night, for most of you were there, at our annual ministry celebration vision night. And it was an opportunity for the church to embed itself in our story, to recognize where God has been present and at work. I'm so grateful for Pastor Karen and for Scott and how they presented the financial report. Because it wasn't just, here's our finances. Because so many times you go into the business part of these meetings and it's, here's all the financials. And all of a sudden, all the work and power of God disappears and it becomes, what are we doing and how are we sustaining this? And I'm grateful that the way we introduced it very much embedded it in the work and presence of God. You got to hear how God is shaping this church and calling us forward, not to leave who we've been behind, but instead to adopt that identity that brings us into new expressions and new places where we'll continue to be the same church we've always been in new and fresh ways that will lead to greater belonging, greater significance, and greater security in the love and grace and power of our God. I asked if you've been able to become aware, if you've perceived how God is present and at work in your life. If the answer to that is you're not sure, then I'm going to offer the invitation again to participate in Altar Lead. Because that's one of the things we're going to engage in, is helping you see and perceive how God is present and at work. And I know it works, because it worked for me. I feel like a weight loss testimonial, like it works because I lost 30 pounds. But I have seen it work, and it doesn't work because it's some programmatic thing, it's some program that if you do X, Y, and Z, poof, you get the right result. But what it does is it works because it helps attune us to recognize the places God is at work that we normally may miss. So I'm excited about where we're going, because I think it continues to help us fully lean into who God has called us to be, and that we are residing in the place where our identity lies. Thank you for being part of our online family. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you get notifications for any future videos or content. And feel free to please share with a friend. You can also follow us on Facebook or Instagram. And if you feel so inclined and would like to donate and support our ministry, please click the donate button found in the description. Thank you, and God bless you.